Hello, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us today as we talk about research translation, taking your research to the bedside. My name is Michelle Peat, and I will be chairing this webinar. I'd like to start initially with an acknowledgement of country. We acknowledge the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people as the custodians of the land in which we live, learn, and work. And we pay our respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. Especially take this time to recognise and honour Indigenous women who are here, as well as those who have gone before us. We look to their collective wisdom in guiding our work and seek continued partnership as we work together to improve health outcomes for all women living in this land. So firstly, I'd like to do some introductions and then we'll jump straight into the talk. So today on the panel, we have Professor Martha Hickey, who's a Professor of Obstetrics and Gynecology at the University of Melbourne. We have Professor Denise Harrison, who is a Professor of Nursing, also at the University of Melbourne, and Associate Professor Helena Frawley, who is the Director of Allied Health Research at the Royal Women's Hospital and Mercy Hospital for Women. We have some wonderful talks lined up today. The structure of today will be that each of our presenters will present their work. We'll allow maybe 3 to 4 minutes for some immediate questions. And then at the end, there'll be some more Q&A time for follow-up questions if time allows. This webinar is being recorded and will be uploaded on the WHRTN YouTube site next week if anyone wants to come back and watch it. But obviously, if you have questions, please pop it into the Q&A section of the Zoom and we'll address what we can, and anything that we can't address in this session, I'll take note of it and we can respond perhaps later somehow. I'll talk to Linda about that. And with that, I'm going to hand over to Martha. Thanks, Martha.
No, thank you, Michelle. So I'm going to talk about known unknowns in the area of menopause. And these slides were part of a webinar commissioned by the British Medical Journal, BMJ, around along the theme of known unknowns. So here are some of my declaration of interests. Cochrane collaboration. I'm a senior investigator at the NHMRC. I have some, actually out of date now, pharma associations, and I'm the topic expert for the UK NICE guidelines on menopause. So in terms of known unknowns with menopause, it's hard to even know where to start. We can't even actually agree what menopause is. You'll see various definitions coming from different perspectives in different publications. And so what's all the fuss about? All those who are born with functioning ovaries will eventually experience menopause, and about 25 million worldwide transition menopause each year. The biology is ubiquitous for natural menopause, but the experience varies considerably between individuals and within the same person over time. So why does menopause even happen in the first place? Nobody really knows. It's thought that females have all the ovarian primordial follicles that they're ever going to have during intrauterine life, that they produce during intrauterine life, and then they never divide again postnatally. So you have all the follicles that you're ever going to have by the time of birth can't be replenished. Of course, that means that in utero time, that regulating that follicle development, and in particular explaining the fact that about 96% of those follicles disappear during prenatal life for reasons that nobody is understood. Very important topic for research to understand why that happens. So around 12% have menopause either prematurely, which is under 40, or early, which is under 45. So it's quite a high proportion of people. It may be iatrogenic, so increasingly the population who've had chemoradiation, usually for cancer, surviving those cancers, but have an induced menopause, either prematurely or early. And until fairly recently, many women undergoing hysterectomy had their ovaries removed at the same time. And our largest population now for oophorectomy are those carrying a BRCA1 or BRCA2 pathogenic variant who are at high risk of ovarian cancer. But usually the cause of premature or early menopause is not known. What symptoms does menopause cause? Well, that's another area where there's big gaps in knowledge. About 10% in some studies, up to 40% in other studies, have no symptoms. Some have severe symptoms, and that's estimated to be around 15%. And about 1/3 overall have symptoms that are either moderate or severe. We've got no way of knowing who is going to have severe symptoms and who isn't. We do know that the nature of symptoms varies so much by race and geography that there is no universal experience of menopause apart from the cessation of menstruation. So menopausal hormone therapy is promoted and is available for the treatment of menopausal symptoms, but does it actually help? Well, it does help reduce vasomotor symptoms, that's hot flushes and night sweats, by around 80%. Unfortunately, when people stop the MHT, around 50% then have resurgent symptoms. There are effective alternatives, cognitive behavior therapy, non-hormonals, and in the last couple of weeks in Australia, we've had approval of fezolinetant, which is the first targeted non-hormonal therapy. So it actually works on the section of the hypothalamus that causes hot flushes. So that's a major change in practice for us. However, we only know the efficacy and safety of estrogen-containing menopausal hormone therapy for women who are over 50 and who are postmenopausal, they should say. We know nothing about its efficacy and safety in perimenopausal women. And whilst it's very helpful for symptoms at the time, it's not recommended to prevent any chronic diseases because of potential risks. So there are no miracles as far as menopause is concerned about menopausal hormone therapy. And the randomized trials of efficacy are all powered to detect changes in hot flushes and not for any other outcomes. So hot flushes are the area of efficacy, but there are many other symptoms that are associated with menopause: fatigue, brain fog, rage, itchiness, all of those things never been shown to improve those symptoms. So who should actually take it? Around 14% of women in the UK, though that has gone up hugely in the last year to more like 30%, and about 20% in Australia take it. So some don't take it. Many women, given the numbers who take it and the numbers who have symptoms, they're clearly a large group of women who have symptoms who don't decide to take it. And what we don't know is whether that's because they can't get it or whether that's because they don't want it. And of course, as quoted in The Lancet in 1975, the prospect of a universal treatment for a large section of the female population is clearly a glittering prize of the pharmaceutical industry. And this is a multi-billion-dollar business. So what about testosterone? If you measure testosterone as women transition menopause, it doesn't change particularly. It falls from the mid-20s onwards, not really over menopause. If you take testosterone, it has a very modest effect on libido. It's only licensed for women who have something called hypoactive sexual desire disorder, which is a DSM diagnosis, and doesn't have any other clinical role that's been demonstrated. So similarly with testosterone, the effect on sexual function is one more sexually satisfying event a month, and that's it. So how can we better support women as they transition menopause? In our recent Lancet series, we've talked about the process of empowerment, which describes the granting of power, rights, or authority to another person. And the model of empowerment that we've developed includes access to realistic and balanced information. At the moment, you can't get that in Australia or even overseas because all the information is different about what symptoms menopause causes and what the pros and cons of MHT are. There's a great need for tools such as decision aids to support these kinds of treatment. We need clinicians who are willing to partner in shared decision-making and need access to effective treatment for those that want it, and joined up care for the prevention of chronic disease, since MHT is not going to do that. And for those who are in the workplace, which is most women of this age, then we need practical support within the workplace for those who have troublesome symptoms. We also should be celebrating the contribution of older women. So 45% of our workforce are over age 50. And if you look at essential workers in areas like health and education, the majority are female, and then more than 70% of the voluntary sector are female. So changing the workplace to accommodate women who may have problematic symptoms is very important. And we argue for a model of diversity rather than disability around this. This is in the context of the UK recently stating that severe menopausal symptoms could be considered as a disability. We're questioning the narrative of hormone deficiency and arguing that menopause is usually a normal natural transition for women. And in particular, think about the negative messaging we may be sending to younger women about this life transition. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for that, Martha. So I'll open the floor to some questions because Martha actually needs to leave to go to another meeting. And so if anyone could pop things into the Q&A or the chat, that would be appreciated. But to start us off, Martha, the Lancet series is an incredible achievement. I think it's the first time ever in the history of Lancet they've done a series on menopause. Well done. So because we're talking about translation, and that's one of the steps to changing the way we view menopause, would you be able to talk us through that process of pulling together that series?
Yes, so the Lancet approached me in 2021 and invited me to do a series, asked me to pitch some topics. They said they'd do 2 papers, and I pitched 4 topics, and they said, we'll take all 4 of them. So that was good, but it was also a lot of work. And very interesting for the authors, they wanted a GP, somebody with lived experience, somebody with a lower middle income country, and early and mid-career researchers represented on each paper. So it brought a lot of diversity to the table.
And obviously you've had a lot of reaction to the Lancet series. Has it been an easy thing to deal with in terms of the responses? Has it been embraced, or have you had to deal with some dissenters as well?
It had a very large response. I mean, we've had about 250 media articles. I think we made a mistake in the press release of describing menopause as being over-medicalized, and people understood that to mean over-medicated. So some of the negative response was around the idea that we were saying too many women were taking MHT, which we weren't. But the issue of menopause not being considered as a disease, I think it's been very important to highlight that, because those that do consider it as a disease have had to justify why they're taking that position. And I think the other important point was these hormonal treatments going to help some things, but it's not going to sort out everything. We need to do more for midlife women than just give them medication.
And maybe just one last question, Martha. So what next?
I think what's next is really to think about how we're going to implement these changes. And for me, because the NICE guidelines are coming out in the next few months, then what's next will be new evidence that really will be supporting what we've said, is that the benefits are important but limited, and the risks are very real. So this is a problem because there's so much fear around menopause, particularly in the UK, that women in their early 40s or even late 30s are asking for hormonal treatments so that they never have to experience menopause.
Yeah, so it sounds like there's a bit of reframing that perhaps needs to happen.
Yeah.
So thank you so much for your time, Martha. I'm now going to hand over to next up. I think we've got Denise. Yes, Denise, I'll hand over to you. You can talk to us about your work with babies.
We have so much evidence now of safe and effective ways to reduce pain in newborns during frequently performed painful procedures. So this is mainly heel lance. Most studies are focused on heel lance, and it's the most painful needle procedure done in all studies. So if possible, feasible, culturally acceptable, breastfeeding when stable, healthy babies during their heel lance or venipuncture If that's not feasible or possible, if the babies are too small or too sick or not feeding, holding newborns skin to skin, and most of the evidence is on preterm babies. And if they're not possible, very small volumes of either sucrose or glucose. So how do we know all this? Well, there's large numbers of randomized controlled trials. There's systematic reviews, there's meta-analyses, there's overviews of systematic reviews, consensus statements, guidelines, and even knowledge translation tools focus both on families and on staff. So this is just an example of the number of systematic reviews on sweet solutions. And so the last Cochrane systematic review of sucrose, so only sucrose, not even glucose, became so large that the team focused only on Hill Lance, and there were 55 trials and over 6,000 babies. We've conducted a number of two Chinese systematic reviews, and I'll talk about why in a minute. And we included 63 trials over a different 5-year period. Back in 2017, I combined sucrose and glucose in one cumulative systematic review. And before that, there's another Cochrane systematic review and a glucose systematic review. So thousands of babies in hundreds, well over 200 studies now. So this is an example of a knowledge translation tool, so an education video targeted at parents, and this was produced in 2016, and we're still studying this now. And this is an example of a national standard. So this was recently published, national standard of pediatric pain, and all that evidence I've been talking about, the whole lot of evidence of sucrose and glucose, and also kangaroo care and breastfeeding, has been distilled right down to these, just this statement that we recommend for acute pain to breastfeed, give sucrose, and kangaroo care for infants. So how many studies are too many studies, and when do we know we do have enough evidence? And that brings us to what is the principle of equipoise. And so the equipoise is the assumption that there is not a better intervention present for either the control or the intervention group during the design of a randomized controlled trial. So a true state of equipoise exists when we really don't know. There is uncertainty of the benefit of your intervention. So in 2012 now, so over a decade, I published really an ethical paper and said that sucrose during single painful procedures, there is no longer a state of equipoise, and at that time highly recommended that we stop placebo-controlled or no treatment studies of sucrose or glucose for newborns during painful procedures. And a few years later, I conducted a cumulative meta-analysis, which is a bit different from a standard meta-analysis because you're really looking at from the year. So we can see here really from 1999 onwards, we kept publishing and publishing and publishing, but the benefit of effect didn't change. So we've known that sucrose is effective right from the late 90s, and all we've done is just shown over and over and over and over again. And this, the 2015 was the last one, so even this is 9 years out of date now, that sucrose and glucose reduce pain in babies. So over the years, with our Cochrane systematic reviews and my meta-analysis, we didn't include Chinese studies, but yes, there's this whole world out there of Chinese databases. And so I partnered with our Chinese colleagues, and back in 2019, we published a systematic review and meta-analysis and included 31 trials. And then only 4 years later, we looked at the literature again and found another 32 trials. So even in the Chinese literature, there is so much evidence of sucrose and glucose. And interestingly, most of these don't even cite our large Cochrane systematic reviews. So it's as if it's a brand new question. We don't know the answer. Most of these don't reference any systematic reviews that have gone before. So if we look at the cumulative number of newborns in sweet solution studies, there's almost 25,000 now, but yet evidence of analgesic effects were really known before the year 2000. So do we have enough evidence yet? And what do we do about this? So just going back to the Declaration of Helsinki, and it's interesting that many studies that I review today and that are published today clearly state this is ethical, we followed the Declaration of Helsinki. But in fact, when we read this, these new studies, the researchers actually haven't followed this at all. And so we look down, if no evidence exists, the use of placebo or no intervention is acceptable. So that's not the case. And so even if we look at this next statement, where for compelling reasons, the use of an intervention less effective than the best proven one, or placebo is necessary to determine the efficacy or safety of an intervention, and when the person will not be subjected to additional risk of serious or irreversible harm. So it's really this serious or irreversible harm that people seem to be citing. Well, it doesn't matter, it's just another heel lance, just another heel prick, and we don't use these strategies in our unit. So it's ethical to do this study. And by the way, we get ethics approval and the parents' consent. So it's really not the case. We do know that the strongest association of adverse outcomes in preterm babies is due to repeat painful procedures. And so certainly one, the baby cries, but over and over and over again, preterm babies and sick babies who are not receiving best pain management are certainly at additional risk. But it's not so clear cut, obviously. So why do we keep doing the studies around the world? So one point is access to published information. And so when I was stating about the Chinese systematic reviews, most of these authors don't have access to English databases. And so we can be as critical as we want, saying, well, they don't even cite the Cochrane systematic reviews. They may not have access. They may not understand even if they do have access. And so we've really acted upon that by producing our parent-targeted video in multiple languages and evaluating around the world. And so the parent-targeted video is now in 10 languages, and we've evaluated the Chinese version in a couple of studies through WeChat and through various conferences that we've done with our Chinese colleagues. In terms of the Portuguese video, we've evaluated this in a number of studies, including a large Facebook study. Our Farsi video, we've evaluated in social media in Iran, and that was one of the most difficult because no matter what social media avenues we used, the video was banned because it does show a breast. But anyway, we got the study done, and then in French as well. And in all these studies, including multiple English studies, the results are actually the same across all the studies, that the video is acceptable, and the people answering these are both parents and clinicians. The video is acceptable, the video is persuasive, but yet most had not previously used breastfeeding and skin to skin before, but yet after seeing the video, they had very high intent to use these strategies. But there are barriers, and barriers that clinicians say we can't do the heel ants because we don't know how to position ourselves. So this barrier showed up over and over again. So we went back to the drawing board and co-produced another video, but this time targeted clinicians. And it was really, and we partnered with an occupational health and safety physiotherapist. So it's focused on the ergonomics. So how do we position ourselves? So we finished this study last year, and we're still writing up results, but responses for 729 nurses and midwives in Australia. And in a nutshell, we know the evidence. So it's no use thinking we have a knowledge gap. People don't know the evidence. They actually do. And the good thing is most people caring for healthy babies self-report that they do breastfeed during heel lances. Most people caring for sick babies self-report that they use sucrose, but yet most report that parents never ask to be involved, especially across fathers, and nearly all reported that the video is persuasive and useful across settings. So we have an intervention targeted at both parents, both clinicians, and now it's really trying to see what actually is happening from the parent's point of view and in the clinical world. But we definitely know enough about analgesic effects of sweet solutions. We know enough about family-led strategies, breastfeeding and skin to skin, and so there should be absolutely no more placebo or no treatment or ineffective treatment arm effectiveness trials in newborn pain research. Babies still need us. I've been showing this slide for a very long time, but they still need us to reduce their pain. And so thank you, and I look forward to further discussion.
Thanks for that, Denise. Really interesting. Again, if you have any questions, please post it in the Q&A or in the chat. So Denise, what incredible work there. And I think a couple of things that came across to me was that what you're trying to, in terms of research translation, you're kind of covering a few different areas. You've got trying to change research direction, so translating the knowledge and where we go, as well as clinical practice. So maybe if we start with that, that research direction of no more placebo-controlled trials. What do you think, like the challenge you talked about was around language and getting into countries where there's a lot of control over what people see. How do you think we can overcome that?
Yeah, so it's really working with our organisations as well, and trying to establish a consensus statement. Like for years, it's almost been me and a few colleagues getting our voices out there. We're too small. We really need our organisational groups. So that's our International Association for the Study of Pain. And our voices are there. But even then, most of the members, not all, but most are from developed countries. And when we really look into who's publishing these now, and now that we've just had the publication of the new Cochrane Systematic Review, it's only sucrose, so they're missing half of the sweet solution studies, but still, during heel ants, I think we really need to do another dive into where are these newer studies coming from. And the problem is that in developing countries, there is less representation in our world organisations, but still, it's still trying to get the messages out there through our various pain chapters and our breastfeeding chapters. The other thing is, in terms of sicker babies, parents have very little role, and getting that message out there is going to be even harder. So how do we get parents into neonatal units? And constantly I'm told, oh no, they're not allowed until the last minute. So we question, and we have to be very careful and diplomatic. We don't work in these countries. But how do the parents learn how to care for their baby then? Oh, well, that's just the last few days they're taught. We teach them. So it's a very different environment to our very developed Western world. And it's still working with our colleagues around the world to try and at least stop the trials and to implement the parent-led evidence.
And so that sort of takes me to our next question. So you've got this evidence that these videos, are effective and acceptable. Have there been challenges in getting it into clinics? Or have you faced challenges?
Yes, I mean, again, with interventions like this, they're out there. They're in virtually cyber world. They're on YouTube, they're on Twitter, they're on Facebook, and they are on many sites now. Australian Breastfeeding Association, for example, in Australia, the World Pain Society, Australian Pain Society, Playgroup Victoria, and getting the message out there and the videos out there. Even so, when we study these videos, most people still haven't seen them. And so I guess it's just getting that messaging out there. And they don't have to watch a 5-minute video, but we still question how to get that best message out there to staff and to families. But we know from our Australian study, families don't ask, mothers don't ask, fathers don't ask. So it gets back to, okay, we've really got to promote best pain management practices for newborns in our neonatal units and our healthy baby clinics. But it looks like in Australia that is happening. The results are way more promising than they were a decade ago when I was studying this. So the evidence is actually getting out there, which is very promising. We just have to keep going.
Oh, that's great. We'll come back to that in our Q&A, but just for time, I might hand over now to Helena. But yeah, some great topics for conversation in our Q&A. Helena, over to you.
Thanks, Michelle. Share my screen. Can you see the slides okay?
Yeah, great.
Great.
Thanks.
Okay, thank you. All right, well, thank you for asking me to talk about this. It's been interesting listening to Martha and Denise, a couple of similar themes emerging from Martha's around empowerment and agency, and from Denise's about the slow burn and a long story and an evidence practice gap. And for me, it's almost coming up to the 17 years it takes to translate evidence into practice. So I've still got a few more years to go, but I don't want it to be 17. So I'm going to take you back. This is a bit of a story to a grant I submitted in 2009. It was funded for the next 2 years. It was a fellowship, an NHMRC TRIP, or Translating Research into Practice. So the idea was to find an evidence practice gap and propose an implementation research study. So it was a part-time fellowship. There were no project funds, so a very small project, and it was about incontinence. So I was very interested in the lack of implementation of evidence into practice in this field. So I'm focusing particularly on incontinence during pregnancy. We focus on a lot of problems during pregnancy that naturally resolve. Unfortunately, for many women, incontinence doesn't, and the onset in pregnancy can last lifelong and be devastating. And we actually have an opportunity to prevent it. That's what we're not doing. We know that some women come into pregnancy with the problem already there, about 11%. But for the majority, the first onset of leakage occurs during that first pregnancy, and it gets higher as the pregnancy progresses. So by the end of pregnancy, more than half of women are experiencing urinary leakage. And it does not go away with the birth for all women. So it has postnatal impacts. In fact, the onset of incontinence during pregnancy is a very strong predictor of still being incontinent 5 years later, with little modification by mode of delivery. So it's not that a cesarean will prevent this problem. And we know it has many other sequelae, nearly doubling the risk of developing postnatal depression and a lot of other social, economic, physical and emotional issues. We do know that we have good evidence to treat it. and not just to treat it, but to prevent it. So that's what the focus for this project was on. I want to be able to prevent the problem from being there for these women that suffer it lifelong. And we have enormous body of evidence, like in Denise's study, we have nearly 100 RCTs, multiple systematic reviews over 2 decades of research. So it's level 1 evidence, a grade A recommendation that all pregnant women, whether they're incontinent or not, should be offered pelvic floor muscle training to prevent the development of incontinence. It's effective, it's low risk, it's low cost, and it appears in all the international guidelines, NICE guidelines, Cochrane, the world guidelines. So we certainly know that if we could prevent it, we will reduce that risk of developing incontinence postnatally. The problem is that it's not being done. So why? The first thought is, well, perhaps the evidence is not reaching the clinicians who need it. And I found that, in fact, that was true. Another very important political reason was that it did not appear in the Department of Health Pregnancy Care Guidelines at the time I designed this study. So that's what I saw as the evidence practice gap. These Department of Health guidelines would come out every few years, and still there was a lack of reference to the very strong evidence and the high recommendation that this should be offered. So why was that the case? Well, I still don't have the answer to that, but perhaps why it was not being seen as a primary maternity care issue is that in all the studies, the intervention was provided by physiotherapists, because that's an intervention that we do. But physiotherapists are not primary maternity care providers. We do not see every pregnant woman. So for me, that was perhaps a clear gap, that this service needs to be offered by those clinicians who are the primary maternity care providers. So that's where I felt I would have the best impact. So the idea was to engage with midwives and obstetricians. So the aim was to improve the uptake of this recommendation with fidelity to the research, so try to replicate it so that we would get the same results for incontinence prevention and treatment to pregnant and postnatal women in a public health maternity setting. So it was a pilot implementation, the primary and secondary aims, as I've just said, and I used a process of change model, which was a little bit iterative, a bit like action research, or doing it as we go, because this was a first test. So we looked at the barriers and enablers at each step of the process, modify them in consultation with the clinicians. What's the problem with being able to implement these guidelines? Where is it falling down? How can we change processes and systems to enable it? And using a lot of behaviour change techniques. So this was the process of change model I used. This one had 5 steps. There are simple ones with 4, some with 7, but they all move the system, the clinician, the patient, or the intervention through various stages of change. So this is the one I applied for the clinicians. My overall TRIP fellowship had 3 parts, but I'll just talk about what I did with the clinicians to try to test the implementability of this recommendation. So I focused on that pregnancy visit because I wanted the prevention aspect. So at one pregnancy visit, that the midwives and the obstetricians would do continence screening, teach how to do pelvic floor muscle exercises, and refer on for physiotherapy care if required. I'll just focus on that one now. In short, and this is the quick one slide of the results of that study, because then I want to talk about what happened next. So with two sites at Eastern Health, I used Box Hill and Angliss, where I was working in allied health research. So I started with a pool of 30 midwives who were interested in being part, and 20 obstetricians. But I found very early on there was a lack of awareness of this problem, that incontinence occurs during pregnancy. There were a lot of myths. So a lot of my work in the early stage was myth busting. But all the same, there wasn't a huge interest in addressing this problem. So we moved on to the next stage, which is, well, who's actually got insight into what happens and what's required to be done? I lost most of the obstetricians at that stage. So at that point, most of them said, not my job, I don't do this. This is going to be somebody else's job to address. So time was a big issue for the midwives. They have very busy antenatal clinics, and this was just one more thing to fit into an antenatal clinic visit. And I wanted two parts. I wanted them to screen for the presence of incontinence, because if it was already present, there would be a different pathway, and then to teach all women how to do this exercise. One of the things about pelvic floor muscle training is it's quite a tricky exercise to do well, to do correctly, and up to half of women are not able to contract their pelvic floor muscles correctly with a very simple verbal instruction or a leaflet. So we don't recommend those methods of treatment. It takes quite a detailed explanation. So there was a lot of barriers about the time that it would take and addressing this particular topic. The best way to check that the woman is doing it correctly is to visualize her perineum. And there was a lot of cultural opposition to doing that during pregnancy. And I was surprised that a woman can go through 9 months of pregnancy and nobody looks at her perineum to assess whether her pelvic floor muscles work or not. At the next step of who will actually accept a modified version of my implementation, we got down to the 10 midwives who had more autonomy over their clinic. So those who could plan the visits and plan the content with a bit more freedom were willing to take that next step. But at that point, we realised they actually didn't have the knowledge or the skill set. It's not part of undergraduate midwifery training. So there was very little knowledge about how to raise the topic, what to look for, what are the red flags, what are the risk factors. So there was a lot of instruction at that stage and confidence building and lunchtime seminars. I still had those same 10 midwives with me at the next stage. And then once their confidence had increased, they were able to implement the practice. The feedback was overwhelmingly positive. They said it changed their practice. They were getting such great feedback from the women, even some who had started to experience leakage, then learned how to do the exercises and found, oh, it works. Amazing. So that was a very positive feedback loop. And right through to the end, those same 10 midwives stayed with the project. And when I kept in touch a couple of years later, they were still doing it. So it was a very small scale, unsustainable and not scalable intervention, but with a lot of effort, it shows that it can work, but it needs an awful lot of resourcing. But once you're in the habit, it's working. So what to do with that? Well, at the same time that I was doing this, colleagues across the world were also interested in doing it. So we got together. And so what we found was that if midwives were autonomous, they could be able to implement this. However, because it was a modified version without strict fidelity to the evidence, really don't know how clinically effective that was. We had a lot of attrition, as you saw with my dropouts. And so this leakage pipeline, I think, was made for incontinence research. It really highlights how much we lost along the way. But any improvement we can make is beneficial. And it was certainly the first time it had been tried in Australia in primary maternity care. We found a lot of gaps that need to be filled, and that's really the big body of work to do. So we started a maternity project with the Continence Foundation, did a roadshow around the country, training at midwifery undergraduate, YouTube videos. I co-wrote a course for the Australian College of Midwives to give some education in this area. But that's a really slow burn and very intensive. I then made a teaching video for midwives so that could be more scalable, and that's available to all healthcare clinicians. At the same time, colleagues across the globe were doing exactly the same thing. And they invited me to collaborate because of my experience and the results. The big difference, they were funded millions of pounds to do what I did for nothing. So this had a much better chance of success. And quickly to the end, we did a lot of work over the next 5 years, published a lot of outputs, but basically found the same thing, that it was really difficult to do. Midwives needed a lot of resourcing and a lot of support, and there needed to be a whole of health service change. We've recently done a YouTube video. The NHS have put that out. It's had fabulous acceptability and uptake in just a few months, and it's been nominated for a UK award. So we finished our cluster randomised controlled trial. It's under review. Results are about to come out. But the sneak preview is this is a huge issue, and it will not change with a one-line entry in a clinical practice guideline that pregnant women should receive pelvic floor muscle exercises. It requires a lot more work than that. So I might stop there. There is a little bit more of a sequelae, but I might leave that to question time if there's time.
Great. Thanks for that, Helena. So yes, please pop your questions on into the Q&A if you have any for both Helena and Denise. But Helena, thank you for sharing that experience with us, because it feels like it was a no-brainer. You had your preventable thing with long-term implications, low risk, low cost, and yet, you know, translating it into practice was hard. And some of the things that really resonated with some of the work I do in onco-fertility care was this concept of it's not my job, I don't have time, and the lack of confidence. And those are sometimes difficult things to implement, like you said. So we know healthcare funding is difficult. In your experience, was there anything, you know, you did it on a very minimal budget. Is there anything that we can do that's cheap and easy, or do we just need to get money to do this?
We've got some of the resources already developed, which hopefully can be shared now to give us that scale. So it won't cost us any more other than a bit of planning time, but the videos, all the resources that have been developed, which go a step above that lip service of just saying to a pregnant woman, are you doing your pelvic floor exercises? Tick, great. But she'll say yes without really knowing what to do. So to actually do it effectively does take a little bit more investment. The other thing that I often am still not reconciled with, to do this with primary maternity care providers will take enormous system change, investment, right from undergraduate education in the fields right through to implementation. And yet we already have a discipline who are trained to do it. So would it not be more cost efficient to just shift our resources or focus for the pregnant women to have physiotherapy delivered pelvic floor muscle training, because they've already got the skills, so we don't need to invest. However, it does mean another point of care. So that in itself is a barrier. So there is no quick fix.
No quick fix. And I might go to Sarah. Sarah's put two questions in. I might go to the one that relates to what we're just talking about first, Helena. Sarah's asked, why is it easier to get funding for research than to actually implement the evidence? I don't know that we could say getting funding for research is easy, but clearly implementation is a bigger issue. So Denise and Helena, I don't know if you guys want to comment on that.
Well, I think getting the funding relies on a compelling application. And so probably after those first few slides, you thought, well, it's a no-brainer. And the same with Denise's study. The evidence is there, we're not doing it. Oh, well, let's just fund them to do it. But implementation is a whole other ball game. There are local contexts, and context is specific. Context means everything, really. So what does work somewhere else may not work in your workplace. So you need to make a lot of adjustments. That's just one reason why implementation is so hard. It takes time. There is investment required. One of the biggest reasons is it requires behaviour change. So implementation of any sort of any intervention means somebody has to change what they're doing, the person or the whole health system, and behaviour change is difficult. And most of the primary research did not require behaviour change. So it's a whole new challenge.
And especially in a already quite stressed system. Denise, do you have any thoughts to add?
I guess in terms of hierarchy of medical research, it is still those multi-site, blinded, randomized controlled trials, very quantitative data that is still overall favoured, and it doesn't lend itself to implementation research. So it's changing the perceptions of high quality research. But certainly in Canada, knowledge translation, implementation, science research is very much valued. We just haven't quite caught up here.
So hopefully we'll see that change or that shift. And And certainly, and Helena, you talked about this, and again, in some of our work, which has been in one hospital, but if we can embed it into the routine care pathway, we found a huge shift. Like if it was just literally part of, you have to talk to someone about your fertility preservation, then it was happening. But it was a big systemic shift. Denise, there's a question here for you. It seems that, a comment. It seems that HRECs around the world need a better understanding of the Declaration of Helsinki. Could you comment on that?
Yeah, it's a really good statement. And certainly when we try to look at why these studies are in the end still being submitted for publication and published, we go back through all the steps. And one of the steps is definitely an ethics approval has approved it. But the problem with ethics boards are made up of a very multidisciplinary team, including volunteers, and they get so many requests and they cannot be experts in all areas. And they really rely on what the researchers tell them. So the first protocol has got to be the researchers to make sure that they do a systematic review or a very comprehensive literature review to inform their question. And it just comes back to them and their supervisors, because ethics committees just, unless they know, they just don't have time to really research every application that comes in. So it certainly is an issue that they rely on what the researchers' argument is.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And, I guess that's keeping in mind as researchers, we also have obligations with these declarations, and we sign tick boxes to say that we do. And it's that big question of risk versus harm, isn't it, that we need to ask ourselves, and what's clinically relevant. Jordana, I see your comment about the risks of taking MHT and HRT. I can certainly reach out to Martha to comment on that. I do know that she's currently involved in the NICE guidelines for menopause, and they will be coming out soon with an update on the risks. So also keep your eyes out for that. And we probably have time for one more question. So Sarah's asked, can stronger, more involvement of people with a lived experience help to bring about implementation? Yes, we haven't really touched on stakeholder involvement, but certainly in Martha's work, I know for a fact that she's got, I guess one of her drivers is to include people with lived experience in all of her research. And I know Denise and Helena, you guys do too. So maybe you can talk about how having consumer involvement has really strengthened the research and the implementation of the work you do.
With the appeal group in the UK that I collaborated with, that was a hugely powerful arm of every work package we did for that NIH funding was co-design, engagement, involvement with consumers at every step along the way. And I'm sure that helped where there was success. I'm sure that was part of the reason for the success. So absolutely can't speak highly enough of the value of doing that.
Yeah, the same with my work. It's obviously mainly pain in babies. So the babies grow up and the families sort of go off on different avenues, but absolutely families have been involved in all the research at different stages, and certainly in the co-production of the video. And so having that parent voice in my research is incredibly important. It's still just a small voice, but it is a voice, and they can certainly move the research along.
Yeah, and I've noticed, and certainly in Martha's work, she's been doing a lot around priority setting, and that is really going to the people with lived experience and asking them, what research do you want done? And it's certainly a core part of what Wharton does as well. Where rather than just having researchers deciding what research needs to be done, let's go to the people it affects and prioritise that. So I do think there is certainly a shift in the research space, even over the course of my career. Grants, a few of the grants I have require consumers on your working parties and providing comment. So I do think it really just improves all the work we do. Okay, so we've got 2 minutes left, and I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Helena and Denise for their words of wisdom and for sharing their experiences with us. You know, I guess my take home is it's a long process to implement anything. Funding helps, but fundamentally the most important thing is persistence and just, you know, figuring out how to overcome the barriers, how to address the needs, and making it as easy as we can for everyone to implement this change. So in terms of next steps, then please everyone look out for the WHRTN newsletter, the quarterly newsletter that comes out in May, which will have future webinars listed. I hope everyone found this useful. As I mentioned, this will be uploaded on the YouTube channel for anyone who wants to rewatch it or share it amongst their networks. So if there's lessons here that you feel that would be useful for others. And with that, I will close this session. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you.